Hello, welcome to the Officio Spotlight podcast. My name is Simon Lipscomb and thank you very much for listening. As regular listeners to the podcast will know, over the period of this COVID-19 pandemic, we've had the great privilege of talking to many of the UK government's leaders tasked with the myriad of procurement and supply chain challenges that this virus has presented. We've spoken to Jackie Rock at NHS Test and Trace, Gary Horsfield about the challenge to find adequate PPE, and Ruth Todd, who was the Programme Director at the Vaccine Task Force. And today we're really lucky in that we get to talk about one of the missing pieces of the puzzle when it comes to the UK's response to COVID-19. Anyone listening to this podcast for the first time, I would recommend going back and listening to those podcasts, particularly the discussion on VTF and the discussion about PPE, because I think it acts as a very good lead into the conversation we're about to have. And this conversation is about how actually the UK government got vaccines into people's arms and how that was achieved at a scale and at a speed that is completely unprecedented. So I'm delighted that joining me today is Steve Gibb. Steve is the Supply Chain Director of the NHS England vaccination programme. He's a supply chain professional with more than 25 years. So Steve, thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. As always in these discussions, we should probably start at the beginning. So if possible, I'd like to take you back to March 2020 and understand a little bit about how you first came into government's response to this pandemic.
I think like a number of supply chain professionals, we received a call asking whether we would come and help. I received it from two different sources and suggested that there was a programme of work. So I was planning to take some time out, actually, having decided that I could reintroduce myself to my family. But this was decided to be a far better offer once my family realised that they couldn't go out either. So going back to March, first thing was to look at the supply chain element. We'd already bought the PPE and it was how we had to, as you probably heard from the previous presenters, how we could manage a scale of what we'd actually purchased and making sure that we could protect the nation in the right way. But we had to bring it into the country at a pace that had never been seen before and also store it and screen it in a way that had never been seen before. So quite an interesting introduction into the NHS. It was my first foray into government and it was definitely a fast track, definitely an education.
And Steve, I guess that role in the PP programme then led to what I think we'll focus most of our discussion on today, which is your role on the vaccination rollout. In the conversation with Ruth, we talked about the fact that the VTF had undertook this process to acquire a load of vaccines. I guess the baton was then passed on to yourself and your team about how those vaccines ultimately make its way into people's arms. Again, it'd be really interesting to start at the beginning again. I guess the ask was enormous, which was how do you vaccinate an entire population and how do you do that at speed? It'd be interesting just to talk about some of the steps you put in place and how you started to build and rise to that phenomenal challenge.
Probably say this a couple of times as we go through this. It's genuinely a privilege working with some of these professionals that you have, and you've referenced already Ruth and others. But my SRO was Emily Lawson, and she was asked to come in and step into the vaccine programme. And with that, she took a couple of people with her. I was fortunate to be one of them. We were given a very clear steer in terms of what was coming into the country and when by Ruth and the team in terms of the upstream supply chain, and the procurement arm had put us in the best place possible. Walking into it fresh would be the word I'd use. And first of all was to understand whether we could utilise the existing networks, use the existing framework that we actually had within the NHS supply chain, but realised that we were going into their peak, into the high risk, we had to protect their networks too. And it soon became evident that we had to build something real time. And we had 6 weeks, and that included the procurement element of the consumables that went with the process end to end. Yeah, so quite an exciting task.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of the responsibility of your programme, vaccine reaches our shores. It was everything from there, was it, in terms of the supply chain planning?
Our responsibility was also getting the equipment, the consumables, setting the estates. We had a hospital hub framework, but we had to complement that with the PCNs, with the GP network. We just had to mobilise. Also, we had the vaccination centres, which was we probably know it as there's some quite popular venues in terms of what we wanted to do in terms of football grounds and bits and pieces. So as you can imagine, in that early period of lockdown, we had very large estates that we had to mobilise, not quite to the scale of Nightingale, but football grounds were being mobilised with 40 and 50 pods. An operating pod is the ability to vaccinate in real time. So it was actually everything, from procurement of the pens to the screens and to literally every single consumable you can imagine from a medical point of view. But we had to take it out the core supply chain because, again, we couldn't stop the hospitals ticking. So everything sat outside that framework. So it was a standalone procurement arm as well, which was actually with 6 people that actually engineered the whole piece. So we're able to stay ahead of that. Defibrillators and bits and pieces. I can tell you some fantastic stories about us having to get in defibrillators live.
Please do.
One of the moments was having to message the vaccine minister to ask him if he had any contacts, and in America because we had to get our defibrillators off the airport in Miami, and we had to get them into the next 48 hours because we wanted to deploy live. So there were so many moments like that. The amazing thing about this is we'll talk about the complexity of actually trying to fit within this massive machine of the NHS, but the can-do response from everyone we worked with is just ridiculous in terms of people, over 1 billion products procured and repositioned within 12 weeks. And you think about any other supply chain doing that, and just 2,500 touch points within 12 weeks. Just scale of the build was huge. There was no door that was closed to us, and the government was able to open and enabled us to engage at such a pace that made things possible that wouldn't in any other environment be possible.
And Steve, from that experience, what would you consider to be some of the really big challenges you faced, and maybe how you overcame them?
I think in the vaccine program, from a supply chain perspective, the biggest complexity obviously was the temperature controlled element at the beginning, not ever been embarked on before at the scale or the rate that we were asked to do. So,
and Steve, so just for clarity, some of the vaccines need to be stored at certain temperatures, and having all of that in place ahead of the delivery. Yeah.
Not just the temperature control challenge in terms of having the vaccine in the correct transit medium, the correct temperature, but also the number of moves that we're allowed to move. So the early days of the vaccine, the conditions that we were operating under were quite detailed and quite specific. We had to get the controls within a certain number of moves and certain number of, we described it as transitions as we went through. But getting that control in place and the ability to record that inventory at every step to those receipting points was the real biggest challenge that we had. Once we'd modelled it and what we described as our own operator model, getting the other providers and getting people, the service partners, we call them service partners because in normal world you would call them a 3PL engagement, but they weren't. These were genuine service partners that stepped up to work alongside us, both Aloga and McKesson, because they were learning with us and they were deploying with us. So we really did embrace them as genuine service partners throughout this, because this was unknown territory. And then you're trying to feed in live consumables with these products to go into these destinations. So yeah, it was really interesting. And obviously working with PHE, because they gave us the policy and the rule set to work within, but it was getting built live. So the end user deploying this, from whether it be the local GP or whether it be the hospital hub, the first time they were receiving it, if you can imagine the focus, the detail that had to go behind each of those handover touch points. And I genuinely have done supply chain for nearly 27 years. And it was just the timing of it. The sheer timing of what we had to do, because it's a traditional sense would be, people would describe as a day one for day three operating model between the moves between us receiving it at PHE and our central points, then deploying it to our service partners. But each part of that had to be tracked, signed, transitioned, signed, transitions, and it's to the minute. We could only transport it under certain conditions for certain hours, and we had to show that we had temperature control at each handover and each touch point. The first few weeks were incredibly tense. Never been done before.
Yeah, you say you're hugely experienced within the private sector on supply chain, as you say, but when people say unprecedented, it sounds like it genuinely is. That's not kind of hyperbole, right?
Yeah, and people talk about real-time supply chain and people talk about genuine inventory controls and real touch points. This was different. And I've spent most of my time in doing supply chains and value chains at different points, different organizations, but nothing with the sensitivity of this and nothing with the same level of purpose, nothing like it.
And this was an enormous task. It was unprecedented. I think it would be very fair to say that you and your team are recognized to have had a world-leading solution to this problem. What actually made all that happen in the end?
We were allowed to operate within a framework with a number of talented people. I got the opportunity to lead the supply chain element of it, but in terms of the colleagues that I was working with in the NHS, including whether it be the military led by Brigadier Phil, or there's so many people that were instrumental in actually framing this. And they gave us the ability to operate. I'd also say that to operate within an accountability framework that we had, people talk about change management. This was real time. The intensity of it drove the decision making. And so it meant that change management worked in a way that I don't think I'll probably ever see again. And look, there's still the complexity of this model. It's a gift that keeps giving. Now we're operating in the schools environment that brings together different departments and different challenges, but also it's a different control mechanism in terms of going into schools as a school environment that is going into a clinical environment. So just making sure that we just develop and deploy it. We've created a team of very talented people. We have an engine room of some very gifted individuals which have made this possible. People will talk genuinely about a push and a pull model in supply chain, and trust me, this is neither. It's a hybrid on speed depending which model you're actually operating in or which system you're delivering to. Once we've got through the next two phases, I'd welcome anyone to come and we'll live a genuine real-time supply chain. We'll talk about it in real time.
I was also, Steve, really interested to learn. I mean, I guess, let's be honest, supply chains are important, but they're typically not headline news. You were working on a program that I think literally the entire nation was watching and wanting to understand about, and was ultimately being impacted by, right? In jabs going into their arm. Did you and your team feel that pressure?
It was an amazing time for me I used to deliver washing machines and do the final mile for different parts of mixed electrical and think it was important. But to be part of something and to be part of a team that is delivering something like this was, when you went home, you knew you were making a difference. It was very different. And if I'm really candid, it helped reset me, as it probably did a lot of people on this program, because being able to work alongside this caliber and have supply chain at the front is very unusual, as you quite rightly describe, and to be at the forefront of the decision making. And we wanted to describe ourselves as the engine, and lots of people took the pressure away from us to allow us to do the job. And there was definitely a framework around us to enable us to do this, and made a difference.
Yeah, as you say, I guess the mission is still ongoing in that sense. I mean, there's still more work to be done, still more problems to be solved.
I look at this as a gift that keeps giving. The vaccination deployment plan, there's a number of lessons that have been learned in the first two phases, but the complexity builds as you drive through the repeats, as you do the second doses, as you step through the different cohorts.
Steve, sorry, why is that? Why does the complexity build as you get into those phases?
Because the initial phase of deployment was relatively straightforward. People were in lockdown. People were definitely wanting their vaccine. Now it's about getting ahead of what the behaviours are of the end user, making sure that we keep ahead of the program. As JCVI give us the next message in the next release, we can't second guess that, because that's governed centrally and we'll always follow good clinical advice. But what we do is have to build a model that's flexible and resilient enough to be there and ready for whatever's thrown at us. The schools immunisation programme has been probably the biggest test actually of the whole programme for me, because of the layer of it. Once you got past the complexity of handling the product, but actually we went from thinking about deploying to 2,000 locations to 8,000 locations in the space of 3 weeks. So that's what I mean by the gift keeps giving on this one. But it's also the fact is that you have to do certain processes like pack down, and certain processes like we have to keep layering in and making sure that we've got that resilient, flexible solution for the end user. Our job is just to enable what clinicians and the end user has to do. And each month we have to make this simpler for them. We have to enable them to draw down on vaccine. We have to systemize what we've built in real time. So the complexity is in actually simplifying it, as everyone will know about supply chains. We need to make it look simple to the end recipient. We need to remove that complexity, just remove the layers of complexity that are clearly there.
And Steve, one of the questions it's actually a question I asked Gary. As we said before, you were a hugely successful, lauded supply chain expert from the private sector. I guess, would you have seen yourself coming into a government role without the pandemic? And if not, how's that experience been? Is it something you would recommend some time in the public sector?
I would definitely recommend anyone comes into the public sector, and particularly within the NHS, for many reasons. One is that you get to work with some amazing people who make complicated things really simple, and you get to bring your strengths to the table, and they want to work with you. They want to change. I think the pandemic has been incredibly useful. Would I have seen myself doing this 5 years ago? No, and I would never consider this an option, but I'm so glad to have been given the opportunity to do it, and I would highly recommend it, because it's a really strange thing to say, but working with this level of purpose in this environment, and working with these clinical experts, but also working with the frontline staff, has just been incredible.
And do you think the NHS will change from these experiences? Do you think that there are learnings and things that will be taken forward that will change the way the NHS works?
Of course. I think lots of people take learnings out of the pandemic, not just from a traditional supply chain perspective, but a way of working. I think the operating model and the resilience of it has been stress tested in a way. There's definitely key lessons to be learned in terms of how we can build more resilience into this model and more flexibility into this model. And I think it's essential that all departments take learnings from this. And you can see that work happening now with the various reviews that are going on. And the learnings have been quite iterative. It's been described as building a plane in the air, and it feels that way sometimes. But the one thing I will say that I've seen in terms of the processes is definitely the continuous learning and the continuous improvements are documented. They are well positioned, and that transfer of knowledge is key. So each department, the sharing of that knowledge and the playback, we need to spend a bit more time on it, but we will. It's definitely landing.
Yeah. And probably see my last question. I mean, you've played an instrumental part with the team of vaccinating the entire nation. You've saved hundreds of thousands of lives. You've made supply chain cool. For you personally, what does this period mean, and what have you taken from it?
For me personally, it's a game changer. Just purely from a leadership role and being able to be part of this, I don't think it will never leave me. NHS has definitely left a mark on me that won't go. I also think that in terms of being given the chance to operate in this way and been given the chance to make a difference is a personal reset for me. That won't go. I think the reflections you think in your roles that you make a difference. When you get a chance to actually physically reset yourself live in this type of environment, it's been good for me all around. And I genuinely believe this role's given me more than I've given it, definitely.
Steve, thank you so much for your time. I should also, on behalf of everyone, I think, say thank you to you. We, as Officio, had the privilege of working with you on this program. I know how incredibly hard you and everyone on the team has worked and what an enormous difference it's made for everyone. So we should say thank you. Thank you for taking the time to have this conversation. It's another fascinating conversation, another important part of the jigsaw that we've been able to talk about. So yeah, thank you so much.
A pleasure. And without you guys, we wouldn't have delivered this. And you guys have been the engine behind what we try to deliver daily. And thank you for the commitment to the cause and what you've done and what you've delivered for us.
Thank you, Steve. If you enjoyed this podcast, please click the follow button on your chosen podcast platform. We'd also absolutely love to hear your views. So please do leave us a review on those platforms, or indeed send me a message on LinkedIn. And we'll be back soon for another discussion with senior industry figures.